Hi and welcome to this tutorial. In this tutorial we'll revisit the concept of initialization parameters that we saw in the Servlets tutorial, and we'll see how it applies to JSPs. We learned that we can initialize parameters on a servlet-to-servlet basis by using the web.xml or by using annotations and specifying the parameter name and value in the InitParam annotation or the XML node. Now we'll have a look at how we do the same thing in a JSP file. It's very similar, but there are a few differences that we need to note. In this tutorial we'll also do something that we didn't do in our Servlets tutorial. We're going to override the init method. Yes, since the JSP is eventually going to get converted to a servlet, it's going to have an init method. So now if you have to override the init method on a servlet, you just override the init, and we have two signatures. One is with the servlet config as a parameter, and one is without any parameters. You can just override it in a servlet class, and that'll do the trick. But how would you do that in a JSP? So we'll answer these two questions by creating a JSP which takes init parameters and also initializes them in an overridden init method. So let's get started. I will use the same project, but I'll open a new JSP page. I'll create a new page, new JSP file, create it in the web content, and I'll call it initpage.jsp. Okay, so we have a blank template. Now what we're going to do is we will configure init parameters for this. The use case that I have is that I will have a default username, and if the user does not pass any attributes or any parameters to the request, then we show the default username. But if the user passes a value in the request parameter, then we show the the value that the user has passed. So let's configure the username init parameter for this page. Let me save this so that we have the file here. In order to do that, we need to update the web.xml. It is similar to a servlet configuration inside the web.xml. In a servlet configuration, what would we do? We would have a servlet node, and inside the servlet node, we would have a servlet name and a servlet class. Now here I do not have a servlet class name as such because I have a JSP, and I cannot really depend on Tomcat giving the proper name for the servlet. Earlier we saw it was the JSP name underscore JSP as the servlet class name, but we cannot be sure about that. If you put this in a different container, it might have a different name. So what we do here is we do not specify the servlet class node. Instead, we specify a node called JSP5. And this JSP5 node will contain the path to the JSP itself. So here it will be initpage.jsp. So what this is telling Tomcat is that this is actually a JSP page, and I don't know the servlet name, so I'm just going to provide the JSP name here. And now you, Tomcat, has to decide what is the what is the servlet that's generated out of this JSP, and then map this servlet name to that generated servlet. Okay, so now we have defined the servlet. Defining the init param is same as how we would do it in a servlet. So I'll just say init param, and here I can give param name, param value sets. So I'll just have one here, param name. I'll call this default user, and the param value will be default username. And there you go. We have define the servlet. Now, for every servlet, there has to be a servlet mapping. Now, what would be the servlet mapping here? Now, let's say I create a servlet mapping node here. Now, I can give the servlet name, which is same as the servlet name here. But what would be the servlet mapping? What would be the URL pattern? Well, the URL pattern would be the path of the JSP itself, because whenever the JSP is accessed, we would want this kind of configuration to happen. And we know that the URL by default is the JSP URL itself. So I'll just say initpage.jsp. And save. So now what we have done is we have configured a JSP file as a servlet, and we have given InitParam. So all we need is the servlet node in order to specify our init parameter. So now that we have defined it as a servlet and given it a name, we can configure as many init params as we want. So this is how you would configure an init param for a JSP. Now that we have done this here, we will have that init param available here in the servlet config. And accessing this value inside our script tag is fairly simple. I'll just open a new script block here. Okay, since we know that this is inside a JSP service method, I can access the get servlet config. So I'll just say get servlet config dot. Now I have the servlet config object. Now the way to access an init param is to use the get init parameter. Now I just pass the string here, and it will get the value that we have defined. Now what's the value we have over here? We have default user, so I'll pass the same string, and that's it. Now let me just print this. I don't even need to assign it to anything. Just add some text here. The default user from the servlet config is get servlet config, which gets the config for this servlet, and get init parameter, which gets this init parameter, and of course the parameters that we are actually looking for, which will fetch the value for this parameter, which is the default username. Now let's run this and make sure we get the value right. There you go, we have the default username. Now, there's one more thing that we'll do. As we discussed before, we will try to override the init method. Now, let's say I want this inside a session object or inside the application context object, and I want to do this before we actually run the service method. I want this value to be available in the session or in the servlet context before we actually make the call to the JSP service. So in order to do that, I will have to override the init method. Now what is the name of the init method here? We saw that it was jspInit. Let's open up the Tomcat source that's been generated for this JSP. This is the initpage.java. So you can see here there is a underscore jspInit, which is the method. Now we can override this method by implementing a jspInit method in our JSP page. So let's do that. In order to implement a method, of course, we saw this earlier, we need to have a definition tag. You cannot have a script block. So I will say script and then exclamation point. I will have a method definition here. public void JSPInit. Now first let me get the servlet config and the value, again like we did here. Okay, so now I'm getting the servlet config object here, and I'm getting the init parameter of that servlet config object here. So I've combined those two into one statement and setting it into the default user string. Now I can get the servlet context or the session by using the corresponding syntax that we would use inside a servlet. So let me get the servlet context here. Servlet context equals get servlet context. Now I'm getting the servlet context from servlet. So I'm getting the servlet context object from this servlet itself, which is the converted JSP class. Now I can use this context object to set attribute. Set attribute. Now I can pass a string. Default user and this string that we have captured from the servlet config. That should do it. Now I will also print the value here. Value in the servlet context is okay. I will have to get the servlet context here. I cannot use this value because its scope is restricted to the jspInit. I'll use the same thing here. I'll use a get servlet context. Dot get attribute, and I need to pass the same attribute that we are setting here, which is default user. Save this and run this. Well, there you go. We have the value in the servlet config transferred to the servlet context. And since this is happening on the init, which is the first method to run when this object is initialized, so we make sure that the servlet context always has this value. It is the attribute as the default user has been set while the servlet object is initialized, so we know for sure that this is available in any method that we implement. So this is one thing that we need to be clear about, which is the difference between a servlet config and a servlet context. This is something that confused me a lot when I was learning, and I know it confuses a lot of people as well. The servlet config is something that Tomcat passes to us on the creation of the servlet object. So what it does is it checks the our init parameters in the web.xml, and whatever configuration parameters we have set there, Tomcat bundles them into an object called the servlet config, and it passes it to our init method, and it's available for us in the servlet as a member variable called the servlet config. Now the servlet context is actually, we saw another name for it, which is the application context, which is probably a better name, is a scoped object. Just like we have a request and a session, it's a scoped object that's applicable across the application. Just like a request is applicable only for a particular request, and a session is applicable only for a particular user session, servlet context object or an application context object is available across the application. So hope this difference is clear. I'll see you in the next tutorials.